Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales with myself, Rory. If you've never been here before, well, welcome. I'm glad to have you. What we do here is, Varietal Literature, the YouTube channel, is a group of writers from Vancouver who just like to have fun with narrative. And what we do on Tuesday nights at 6:30 is we read old classic fairy tales and folk tales by Fireside. Doesn't work as well in the summer, I think. I think I didn't think through the fire thing in summer weather. But I've never quite figured out what the equivalent of a summer fire would be. Like, whether I should have like a running air conditioner under me or something. What's the soothing sounds of summer? It's probably just waves or something. Anyways, as the title card said today, our first story is going to be about the husband who was to mind the house. In other words, was put in charge of taking care of the house. Now, to that point, obviously these stories are from like the 19th, 18th, and 17th century, or at least were collected then and probably go back further than that. So, this is probably a bigger deal than it would be now. But it is essentially a comedy of errors. It's a very short little story. Now, if you are new here and you're like, let's get on with it. If you're not watching live, then what you can do is look down in the description below. There'll be timestamps for each of the stories we read tonight, because we will be reading more than one. And yeah, that'll jump you right ahead to them. You only have to do what you want to listen to. So, I see GS is there. Good evening, GS. Let's start with the title story, of course, which is the husband who was to mind the house. Sorry, clicked the wrong button there. Almost messed everything up. Pardon me. I got a little bit of a catch in my throat, so I'll be just a sec. Okay. So our first tale comes from East of the Sun and West of the Moon, Old Tales from the North, a book we've been reading a little bit from. It's a short and funny one, called The Husband Who Was to Mind the House. Once on a time there was a man so surly and cross, he never thought his wife did anything right in the house. So one evening in haymaking time, he came home, scolding and swearing and showing his teeth and making a dust. Dear love... Whoops. Don't be so angry, she said. Tomorrow let's change our work. I'll go out with the mowers and mow, and you shall mind the house at home. Yes, the husband thought, that would do very well. He was quite willing, he said. So early next morning, his goody, or his wife, took a scythe over her neck and went out into the hayfield with the mowers and began to mow. Because, of course, back then they didn't have a mower like we do now. They sheathed by hand. But the man was to mind the house and do the work at home. First of all, he wanted to churn the butter. But when he had churned a while, he got thirsty. And so he went down to the cellar to tap a barrel of ale. And so just when he had knocked in the bung, which is the little thing you need to tap it, he was putting the tap into the cask, he heard overhead the pig come into the kitchen. Then he ran off up the cellar steps with the tap in his hands as fast as he could to look after the pig, lest it should upset the churn with the butter in it, which at this point was probably just cream. And when he got up, he saw the pig had already knocked the churn over and stood there roting and grunting amongst the cream which was running all over the floor. Well, he got so wild with rage that he forgot the ale barrel and ran at the pig as hard as he could. He caught it too, and just as it ran out the doors, he gave it such a kick that the piggy lay dead on the spot. Then all at once, he remembered he had the tap in his hand. But when he got down to the cellar, every drop of ale had run out of the cask. Well, he's not doing very well so far. Then he went into the dairy and found enough cream left to fill the churn again. And so he began to churn. For butter they must have for dinner. And when he churned a bit, he remembered that their milking cow was still shut up in the byre. And he hadn't a bit to eat or a drop to drink all morning, though the sun was high. Then all at once he thought 'twas too far to take her down to the meadow, so he'd just get her up in the house on top. For the house, you must know, was thatched with sods, in other words, soil and grass. And a fine crop of grass was growing there. Now the house lay close up against a steep down, and he thought if he laid a plank across the thatch at the back, he'd easily get the cow up. But still he couldn't leave the churn, for there was his little babe crawling about on the floor. And if I leave it, he thought, the child is safe to upset it. So he took the churn on his back, and now went out with it. And when he thought he'd better first water the cow before he turned her out on the thatch, so he took up a bucket to draw water from the well. But as he stooped down at the well's brink, well, remember, it's on his back, all the cream ran out over his shoulders, around his neck and hair, and down into the well. Well, now it was near dinner time, and he hadn't even got the butter yet, so he thought he'd best boil the porridge and fill the pot with water and hung it over the fire. When he'd done that, he had a thought. That cow might perhaps fall off the thatch roof and break her legs or her neck. So he got up in the house to tie one end to her, and one end of the rope he made fast to the cow's neck, but the other he dropped down the chimney and tied around his own thigh. So he had to make haste, for the water now began to boil in the pot, and he still had to grind the oatmeal. So there he was in his kitchen, with a cow on the roof, the rope running down the chimney and tied to his thigh. And he's grinding away at the oatmeal at this point. But while he was hard at it, down fell the cow off the housetop after all, of course. And as she fell, well, I mean, what weighs more, a cow or a man? She dragged the man up the chimney by the rope, and there he stuck fast like a cork in a bottle. And as for the cow, she hung halfway down the wall, swinging and heaving. So he's stuck in that chimney, and the cow's swinging and heaving between heaven and earth, for she could get neither down nor up. And now the goody, his wife, had waited 7 lengths and 7 breadths for her husband to come and call them home for dinner. But never a call they had. At last she thought she'd waited long enough and went home, but when she got there, she saw the cow hanging in an ugly place. She ran up and cut the rope in 2 with her scythe. And of course, as she did that, down came her husband out of the chimney, and so when his old dame came inside the kitchen, there she found him standing on his head in the porridge pot. And there's an image of that right there. Like I said, the first one's a short one and very silly. GS says that well is toast. I don't know enough about wells. Aren't they just underground rivers? Maybe they are. I mean, that's a lot of cream. GS says this is a comical image. Yeah, it is. You know, what I find most impressive about this, I don't usually sort of pause to talk. You know, I'm a writer, so I think in terms of like what techniques are at play and stuff, I can't turn that part off. It's not an enviable trait. It makes reading a very different experience. But one of the things that is most impressive to me is how it captures slapstick, a thing that's very much about timing and all of that in film. It captures slapstick very well. It's complex to paint an imagery in a quick way, so it has the punch of slapstick, but you still have the clarity of what's going on. But they do it very well in this story. It's a very impressive story. I could not write this story. I know that sounds like a silly thing to say, but honestly, this is probably would be more challenging than trying to write like a Great Gatsby, to be honest. Not because the other one isn't deeper, just because there's a lot more techniques that you have at hand for something like Gatsby. Slapstick is not really a well-supported writing style. That suspended cow, says GS. Yes, I agree. Okay. So our next one is a longer one, and it will determine, because it's hard to tell. Different books have different size pages, and it's always hard to tell how long a story will take, no matter how long I've done this. But the length of this story will determine how much or whether we have another story after it. But if we do have another story after it, it's going to be installments from Mikko the Fox, of which we only have 4 installments left. So it means this week and then next week we'll probably be done with Mikko the Fox's epic tale. GS says simple and funny is always the hardest. It is. It is very hard to be, because in writing you have such a burden for detail, and every detail you leave out could be the thing that a person needs to even see it in their head. So our second story also comes from East of the Sun, West of the Moon, Old Tales from the North, and it is called Soria, Moria Castle. Once on a time there was a poor couple who had a son whose name was Halvor. Ever since he was a little boy, he would turn his hand to nothing, but just sat there and groped about in the ashes. His father and mother often put him out to learn this trade or that, but Halvor could stay nowhere. For when he had been there a day or two, he ran away from his master and never stopped till he was sitting again in the ingle, poking about in the cinders. I've seen this in other stories, this poking in cinders thing. I think it's like old world equivalents of watching TV all day. Well, one day a skipper came and asked Halvor if he hadn't a mind to be with him and go to sea and see strange lands. Yes, Halvor would like that very much, so he wasn't long in getting himself ready. How long they sailed, I'm sure I can't tell, but the end of it was they fell into a great storm, and when it was blown over and it got still again, they couldn't tell where they were, for they'd been driven away to a strange coast which none of them knew anything about. Well, as there was just no wind at all, they stayed lying windbound there, and Halvor asked the skipper's leave to go on shore and look about him. He would sooner go, he said, than lie there and sleep. "Do you think you're fit to show yourself before folk?" said the skipper. "Why, you've no clothes but those rags you're standing." But Halvor stuck to his own, and so at last he got leave. But he was to be sure and come back as soon as ever it began to blow, which meant they could sail again. So off he went and found a lovely land. Wherever he came there were fine, large, flat cornfields and rich meads, but he couldn't catch glimpse of a living soul. Well, it began to blow, but Halvor thought he hadn't seen enough, and he wanted to walk a little farther just to see if he couldn't meet any folk. So after a while he came to a broad, high road, so smooth and even you might even easily roll an egg along it. Halvor followed this, and when evening drew on, he saw a great castle ever so far off, from which the sunbeams rose. So as he had now walked the whole day and hadn't taken a bit to eat with him, he was as hungry as a hunter. But still, the nearer he came to the castle, the more afraid he got. In the castle kitchen, a great fire was blazing, and Halvor went into it, but such a kitchen he'd never seen in all his born days. It was so grand and fine, there were vessels of silver and vessels of gold, but still never a living soul. So when Halvor had stood there a while and no one came out, he went and opened the door, and there inside sat a princess who span upon a spinning wheel. "Nay, nay, nay, now," she called out, "deaf Christian folk come hither. But now you'd best be off about your business if you don't want the troll to gobble you up, for there lives a troll with 3 heads. "All one to me," said the lad. "I'd be just as glad to hear he had 4 heads beside. I'd like to see what kind of fellow he is. As for going, I won't go at all. I've done no harm, but meat you must get me. For I am almost starved to death." So, when Halvor had eaten his fill, and the princess told him to try, if he could, brandish the sword that hung against the wall, no, he couldn't brandish it. He couldn't even lift it up. Too big, I guess. "Oh," said the princess, "now you must go and take a pull of that flask that hangs by its side. That's what the troll does every time he goes out to use the sword." So, Halvor took a pull, and in the twinkling of an eye, he could brandish the sword like it was nothing. And now he thought it high time the troll came, and lo, just then up came the troll, puffing and blowing, and Halvor jumped behind the door. "Hoo-ta-to," said the troll, who put his head in at the door. "What a smell of Christian man's blood." "Aye," said Halvor, "you'll soon know that to your cost," and with that he hewed off all his head. 3 of them there were, rolling about the floor. Now, the princess was so glad that she was free, she both danced and sang, but then all at once she called her sisters to mind, and so she said, "Would my sisters were free too." "Where are they?" asked Halvor. Well, she told him about it. One was taken by a troll to his castle, which lay 50 miles off, and the other by another troll to his castle, which was 50 miles further still. "But now," she said, "you must first help me get this ugly carcass out of the house." Yes, Halvor was so strong, he swept everything away and made it all clean and tidy in no time. Now that's a real warrior, right? Does the killing, and he cleans it up. So they had a good and happy time of it. And next morning he set off at the peep of grey dawn. He could take no rest, by the way, but ran and walked the whole day. And when he first saw the castle, he got a little afraid. I mean, we all do. It was far grander than the first, but here too there wasn't a living soul to be seen. So Halvor went into the kitchen, and he didn't stop there either, but went straight further on into the house. "Nay, nay," called out the princess, "dare Christian folk come hither? I don't know, I'm sure, how long it is since I came here, but in all the time I haven't seen a Christian man. 'Twere best you saw how to get away as fast as you came, for here lives a troll that has 6 heads. "I shan't go," said Halvor, "if he has 6 heads besides." "He'll take you up and swallow you alive," said the princess, but it was no good. Halvor wouldn't go. He wasn't at all afraid of the troll, but meat and drink he must have, for he was half starved after his long journey. Well, he got as much of that as he wished, but then the princess wanted him to be off again. "No," said Halvor, "I won't go. I've done no harm, and I've nothing to be afraid about." "He won't ask that. He won't stay to ask that," said the princess, "for he'll take you without law or leave, but as you want, go. Just try if you can brandish the sword yonder, which the troll wields in war." He couldn't brandish it, and then the princess said he must take a pull at the flask, which hung by its side, and when he had done that, he could brandish it. Just then came back the troll, and he was both stout and big, so that he had to go sideways through the door. And when the troll got his first head in, he called out, "Hoo-ta-too! What's a smell of Christian man's blood?" But that very moment, Halvor hewed off his first head, and so on with all the rest as they popped in to the door. Well, the princess was overjoyed, but just then she came to think of her sisters, and wished out loud that they were free. Halvor thought that might be easily done, and wanted to be off at once, but first he had to help the princess to get the troll's carcass out of the way, so he could only set out next morning. Gia says the house husband. Yeah, see? He helps clean up. It was a long way to the castle, and he had to walk fast and run hard to reach it in time, but about nightfall he saw the castle, which was far finer and grander than either of the others. This time he wasn't the least afraid, but walked straight through the kitchen into the castle, and there sat a princess who was so pretty there was no end to her loveliness. She too, like the others, told him there hadn't been Christian folk there since she came thither, and bade him to go away again, else the troll would swallow him alive. "Do you know," she said, "he has 9 heads." "Aye, aye," said Halvor. "If he had 9 other heads, and 9 other heads still, I won't go away." And so he stood fast before the stove, and the princess kept on begging him so prettily to go away. I don't know what it looks like to beg prettily. By the way, that doesn't put an image to my mind. Lest the troll should gobble him up, but Halvor said, "Let him come as soon as he likes." So she gave him the troll's sword and bade him to take a pull at the flask, that he might be able to brandish and wield it. And just then came the troll puffing and blowing and tearing along. He was far bigger and stouter than the other two, and he too had to go on one side to get through the door. So when he got his first head in, he said, as the others had said, "Hoo-ta-too! What a smell of Christian man's blood!" That very moment, Halvor hewed off the first head, and then all the rest as they came through the door. But the last was the toughest of them all, and it was the hardest bit of work Halvor had to do to get it hewn off, although he knew very well he had the strength enough to do it. Probably took a few strikes more. So all the princesses came together to that castle, which was called Soria Moria Castle, and they were glad and happy as they'd ever been in all their lives before. And they were all fond of Halvor, and Halvor of them, and he might choose the one he liked best for his bride. Something tells me this was an older story, and that part wasn't in it. But the youngest was fondest of him of all the 3. There are the 3 princesses. But there, after a while, Halvor... I know you thought I was done. It's not. Halvor went about, and was so strange and dull and silent. Then the princesses asked him what he lacked, and if he didn't like to live with them any longer. Yes, he did, for they had enough and to spare, and he was well off in every way, but still, somehow or other, he did so long to go home. For his father and mother were alive, and them he had such a great wish to see. Well, they thought that might be done easily enough. "You shall go hither and come back hither, safe and unscathed, if you will only follow our advice," said the princesses. Yes, he'd be sure to mind all they said. So they dressed him up till he was as grand as a king's son, and then they set a ring on his finger. And that was such a ring he could wish himself thither and hither with it. But they told him to be sure and not take it off, and not to name their names, for there would be an end of all his bravery, and they'd never see them more. "If I only stood at home, I'd be glad," said Halvor, and it was done as he'd wished. Then stood Halvor at his father's cottage door before he knew a word about it. And now it was about dusk at even, and so when they saw such a grand, stately lord walk in, the old couple got so afraid they began to bow and scrape. But then Halvor asked if he couldn't stay there and have a lodging there that night. No, that he couldn't. "We can't do it at all," they said, "for we haven't this thing or that thing of such a lord as used to have. 'Twere best your lordship went up to the farm, no long way off, for you can see the chimneys, for they have lots of everything." Halvor wouldn't hear of it. He wanted to stop, but the old couple stuck to their own, and that he'd better go to the farmers there. There he could get both meat and drink. As for them, they hadn't even a chair to offer him to sit down on. "No," said Halvor, "I won't go up there till tomorrow early, but let me just stay here tonight. Worst comes to worst, I can sit in the chimney corner." Which, of course, was where he sat before, poking those ashes. Well, they couldn't say anything against that, so Halvor sat down by the ingle, began to poke about in the ashes, just as he did when he lay at home in the old days and stretched his lazy bones. Well, they chattered and talked about many things, and they told Halvor about this thing and that, and so he asked them if they'd never had any children. Yes, they had once a lad whose name was Halvor, but they didn't know whether he'd wandered. They couldn't even tell if he were dead or alive. "Couldn't it be me now?" said Halvor. "Let me see, I could tell him well enough," said the old wife. Rose up. "Our Halvor was so lazy and dull he never did a thing. Besides, he was so ragged that one tattered took hold of the next tatter on him. No, there was never the making of such a fine fellow in him as you are, master." A little while after, the old wife went to the earth to poke up the fire, and when the blaze fell on Halvor's face, just as when he was at home of old poking about in the ashes, she knew him at once. "Ah, but it is you after all, Halvor!" she cried, and then there was such joy for the old couple, there was no end to it. And he was forced to tell how he had fared, and the old dame was so fond and proud of him, nothing would do but he must go up at once to the farmers and show himself to the lassies, who had always looked down on him. And off she went first, and Halvor followed after, and when she got up there, she told them all about how Halvor had come home again, and now they should only see how grand he was, for, said she, "he looks like nothing but a king's son." "All very fine," said the lassies, who tossed up their heads. "We'll be bound he's just the same beggarly, ragged boy he always was." And then, just then, in walked Halvor, and then the lassies were so taken aback they forgot their sarks in the ingle, where they were sitting darning their clothes, and ran out in their smocks. Well, then they were got back again. They were so shamefaced they scarce dare look at Halvor, towards whom they'd always been proud and haughty. I like these little clues about who contributed to this story. "Aye, aye," said Halvor. "You always thought of yourself so pretty and neat. No one could come near you. But now you should see the eldest prince I have set free. Against her you look at the milk just like milkmaids, and the midmost is prettier still, but the youngest, who is my sweetheart, she's fairer than both sun and moon. Would to heaven they were only here," said Halvor, Then you would see what you would see. I should try this at a reunion. Just show up with a ring and be like, actually, I'm a king of a far-off land. But you can't see them right now, but I have girlfriends. He had scarce uttered these words before they stood, and then he felt so sorry, for now what they had said came into his mind. Up at the farm there was a great feast got ready for the princesses, and much was made of them, but they wouldn't stop there. No, we want to go down to your father and mother, they said. Oh, sorry. It's not Halvor. Let's drink some water. No, we want to go down to your father and mother, they said to Halvor, and so we'll go out now and look about for us. So he went down with them, and they came to a great lake just outside the farm. Close by the water was such a lovely green bank. Here the princesses said they would sit and rest a while. They thought it so sweet to sit down and look over the water. There they are looking over the water. What is probably one of the prettiest drawings in this book. So they sat down there, and they'd sat a while the youngest princess said, I may as well comb your hair a little, Halvor. Well, Halvor laid his head on her lap, and she combed his bonny locks, and it wasn't long before Halvor fell fast asleep. Then she took the ring from his finger and put another in his stead, and she said, Now hold me all together, and now would we were all in Soria Moria castle. And so when Halvor woke up, he could very well tell that he'd lost the princesses, and began to weep and wail, and he was so downcast they couldn't comfort him at all. In spite of all his father and mother said, he wouldn't stop there, but took farewell of them, and he was safe not to see them again, for if he couldn't find the princesses again, he thought it not worthwhile to live. Well, he still had about 60 pounds left, so he put them in his pocket, money, for those who don't know, and set out on his way. And so when he'd walked a while, he met a man with a tidy horse, and he wanted to buy it, and began to chaffer with the man. Aye, said the man, to tell the truth, I never thought of selling him, but if we could start a bargain, perhaps. What do you want for him? Asked Halvor. I didn't give much for him, nor is he worth much. He's a brave horse to ride, but he can't draw at all. Still, he's strong enough to carry your knapsack, and you too, turn and turn about, said the man. At last they agreed on the price, and Halvor laid the knapsack on him. And so he walked a bit, and rode a bit, and turned about. At night he came to a green plain where there stood a great tree, at the roots of which he sat down. There he let the horse loose, but he didn't lie down to sleep. He opened his knapsack and took a meal. At peep of day off he set again, for he could take no rest. So he rode and walked and walked and rode for the whole day through the wide wood, where there were so many green spots and glades that shone so bright and lovely between the trees. He didn't know at all he was to whither as he was going, but he gave himself no more time to rest than his horse cropped a bit of grass, and he took a snack out of his knapsack when they came to one of those green glades. So he went on walking and riding by turns, and as for the wood, there seemed to be no end of it. But at dusk the next day he saw a light gleaming through the trees. Would there were folk hereway, thought Halvor. Thought I might warm myself a bit, and get a morsel to keep my body and soul together. When he got up to it, he saw the light came from a wretched little hut. And through the window he saw an old couple inside. They were as grey-headed as a pair of doves. And the old wife had such a nose. Why, it was so long she used it for a poker to stir the fire as she sat in the ingle. Good evening, said Halvor. Good evening, said the old wife. But what errand can you have in coming hither? She went on. For no Christian folk have been here these 100 years or more. Well, Halvor told her all about himself. And now he wanted to get to Soria Moria Castle and asked if she knew the way thither. "No," said the old wife, "that I don't. But I see now, here comes the moon. I'll ask her. She'll know about it, for doesn't she shine on everything?" So when the moon stood clear and bright over the treetops, the old wife went out. "Thou moon, she screamed. "Canst thou tell me the way to Soria Moria Castle?" "No," said the moon, "that I can't. For the last time I shone there, a cloud stood before me." "Wait a bit still," said the old wife to Halvor. "By and by comes the west wind. He's sure to know it, for he puffs and blows around every corner." "Nay, nay," said the old wife when she went out again. "You don't mean to say you've got a horse too? Just turn the poor beast loose in our town, and don't let him stand there and starve to death at the door." Then she ran on. Pardon me. "But won't you swap him away to me? We've got an old pair of boots here with which you can take 20 miles at each stride." Magical boots. What every traveler wants, right? "Those you shall have for your horse, and so you'll get the sooner to Soria Moria Castle." That Halvor was willing to do at once, and the old wife was so glad at having a horse she was ready to dance and skip for joy. "For now," she said, "I shall be able to ride to the church. I too think of that." As for Halvor, he had no rest. He wanted to be off at once, but the old wife said there was no hurry. "Lie down on the bench with you, sleep a bit, for we've no bed to offer you, but I'll watch and wake you when the west wind comes." So after a while, up came the west wind, roaring and howling along till the walls creaked, groaned again. Out ran the old wife. Thou west wind, canst thou tell me the way to Soria Moria Castle? Here's one who wants to get thither." "Yes, I know it very well," said the west wind. "And now I'm just off thither to dry clothes for the wedding that's to be. If he's swift of foot, he can go along with me." So out ran Halvor, with those shoes, by the way, that give him 20 feet to a stride. "You'll have to stretch your legs if you mean to keep up," said the west wind. And so off he set, over field and hedge and hill and fell, and Halvor had hard work to keep up. "Well," said the west wind, "now I've no time to stay with you any longer, for I've got to go away yonder and tear down a strip of spruce wood before I go to the bleaching ground to dry the clothes. But if you go alongside the hill, you'll come to a lot of lassies standing, washing clothes, and then you've not far to go to Soria Moria Castle." In a little while, Halvor came upon the lassies who stood washing, and they asked if he'd seen anything of the west wind who was to come and dry the clothes for the wedding. Aye, that I have," said Halvor. "He's only gone to tear down a strip of spruce wood. It's not be long before he's here." And then he asked them the way to Soria Moria Castle. And so they put him into it right away. Into the right way. And when he got to the castle, it was full of folk and horses, so full it made one giddy to look at them. But Halvor was so ragged and torn from having followed the west wind through bush and briar and bog that he kept on one side and wouldn't show himself to the last day when the bridal feast was to be. So when all, as when then right and fitting, were to drink the bride and bridegroom's health and wish them luck, and when the cupbearer was to drink to them all again, both knights and squires, Last of all, he came in turn to Halvor. He drank their health, but let the ring which the princess had put upon his finger as he lay by the lake fall into the glass, and bade the cupbearer go and greet the bride and hand her the glass. Then up rose the princess from the board at once. "Who is most worthy to have one of us?" she said. "He that has set us free, or he that sits by me as bridegroom?" Well, they all said there couldn't be but one voice and will as to that, and when Halvor heard that he wasn't long in throwing off his beggar's rags and arraying himself as a bridegroom. Aye, here is the right one after all," said the youngest princess, as soon as she saw him, and so she tossed the other one out of the window, which is fantastic imagery, man, and held her wedding with Halvor. And that's the end. Imagine that. You're about to get married. This woman that you spend time with, however long it was he was traveling. And then just some dude shows up and she's like, "No, that's who." And not only is the wedding off for you with this beautiful princess, she literally throws you out a window. All right. We should have time enough for at least one Mikko the Fox story, and then we will call this a day. Just says tossed her out the window? No, she tossed him out the window. She was getting married to another guy that's never really explained why there's another guy she's getting married to be honest. It does feel like there's pieces of this tale missing. I've read it, twice now, and it still feels that way to me. But wherever this guy came from, and for whatever reason that she took the ring from Halvor and replaced it with this other one, I guess it's like a test. But yeah, this other husband she had just tossed him out the window. Okay. So if you haven't been following along, for the last few weeks, we've been going through at the tail end of each of our episodes of Fireside Fairytales, this sort of, I guess you would call it kind of an epic adventure, but it's an epic in an old world sense. Like, it doesn't mean like it's epic and wild, big battles. It's just kind of a long story about the life of some things, which includes some of the epic tropes, but it's mostly about a bear, a fox, and a wolf. And in particular, it focuses on the fox a lot, but actually it gives pretty equal proportion to the wolf and the bear. The fox is clever and rarely outsmarted, and is always just trying to eat things and has no particular conscience in that regard, which is, I guess, fair. I mean, a fox is a fox, right? The wolf is probably the second smartest, but he often gets duped. He gets duped by Mikko the Fox. Almost everyone does. Only the crow outsmarts the fox so far. And Osmo is the bear. And this one is about Osmo, not about Mikko. So, continuing our stories about Mikko the Fox, from the book Mighty Mikko, a book of Finnish fairy tales and folk tales, comes Adventure 13. We're almost done these. Osmo's Share. Again, Osmo is the bear. One day, Osmo the bear came to a clearing where a man was plowing. "Good day," the bear said. "What are you doing?" I'm plowing, the man answered. After I finish plowing, I'm going to harrow and then plant the field, half in wheat, half in turnips. Yum, yum, Osmo thought to himself. Good food that, wheat and turnips. Aloud, he said, I know how to plow and harrow. What do you say to my helping you? If you help me, the man said, I'll share the harvest with you. So Osmo set to work, and between them they soon had the field plowed, harrowed, and planted. When autumn came, they went to get their crops. At the turnip field, the man said, Now, what do you want as your share? The part that grows above the ground or the part that grows below? Osmo the bear, seeing how green and luxuriant turnip tops were, said, Give me the part that grows above the ground. After that, he'd harvest the turnips. They went on to the wheat field, where the man put up the same question. The wheat stalks were all dry and shriveled. Osmo looked at them wisely and said, This time you'd better give me the part that grows under the ground. The man stifled a snicker and agreed. One day following the winter, the two met, and the man invited the bear to dinner. Osmo was very hungry at that point, accepted the invitation gladly. First, they had baked turnips. Oh, but these are good, Osmo said. I've never tasted anything better. What are they? Why, the man said, they're the turnips from that field that you and I planted together. The bear was greatly surprised. Then they had some freshly baked bread. How good, Osmo exclaimed. What is it? Just plain bread, the man said, baked from the wheat you and I planted together. Osmo was more surprised than ever. Why, do you know, he said, my turnips and my bread don't taste a bit like this. The man burst out laughing, and Osmo could only wonder why. There you go. Little short one. You know, we do have a decent sum of time left. I probably could do the next one, but I think I'm going to leave it. The next one actually is a version of a tale we've heard before. I think we heard it in the Ukrainian tales, which makes sense because actually there are a few crossovers between the Finnish tales and the Ukrainian tales. And I'm sure there's something to that, but talk to someone who knows history better than I do. GS says, Mikko's adventures are like Saturday morning cartoons for kids. That is exactly how I see them. Yes. And I think it's very interesting to see that there's like these old forms that are still sort of preserved just in new mediums that we've always kind of had the same want, right? Like we've wanted sort of long adventures that you might tell over multiple sittings. And we've liked, you know, little children's stories about silly little things screwing up and being dumb. Like we're pretty consistent as a species is what I'm saying. All right. Well, just a reminder that tomorrow we do an episode of Big Van Book Club live at 6:30 as well. If you haven't been following along, the book we are reading is Francis Peck's The Broken Places. And basically what you do is you just catch up on the reading, which we're at the end of part 3 right now of the book, which I think is chapter 12 or 13. 13. Chapter 13. And we go through those chapters in order and we discuss it. Myself, Avalon, and the chat. And we just sort of share the things we like, the thoughts we had, the things that reminded us of. It's a book club. It's about liking books. I don't know if you've ever been in a book club, but I feel like people overthink it. It's just you read a book and then you talk about stuff you like, and that's about it. And yeah, anyways, the Thursday we do the Varietal Show, which is live writing. And we're doing sort of a chill one this Thursday, which is we're going to practice prose. We're going to type out stuff together, share it in chat. It's a surprisingly popular thing that I do. I call it the Bob Ross thing, so I'm going to have to come up with another name because I'm pretty sure that's going to get me sued. If you don't know, the people who own the likeness to Bob Ross are fairly litigious and not the family somehow. So I'll have to figure that out when it comes to it. But you should join us for all of that. If you enjoy stories, if you enjoy talking about books, reading, or writing, that's what Varietal is about. My name is Rory. I'll keep the fire warm for you, or whatever the equivalent is, cool in the summer. You have a good sleep. Thank you so much, GS, for coming by and keeping me company.